we are very happy now to go from panel to a keynote speech. And we will now be able to listen and learn from Anna Damas de Matos, Senior Policy Analyst at the OECD. She will be joining us online, talking about migration integration insights from the International Migration Outlook 2024. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for this invitation to participate in this 4in2 conference. I hope you can hear me well and that you can see my slides. So over this half an hour presentation, more or less, I'll try to show you a little bit of recent work of the OECD on migrant integration. We're going to look at labor market outcomes. We're going to look at the really last years. We're going to look at difficulties and challenges faced by certain groups, and particularly by migrant women and migrant mothers. We'll look also at a recent project on migrant entrepreneurship, where the idea is really to look at the two sides of the same phenomenon, so as entrepreneurship as job creation, but also as a pathway to integrate into the labor market. And before concluding, we'll touch a little bit upon an issue that is very important in all OECD countries at the moment, which is the issue of housing. But before we start looking at the outcomes, I wanted to share with you, some facts about migrant populations in OECD countries, and in particular, in these last years where there have been a lot of developments. So when we look at the last decade, from 2013 to 2023, the share of immigrants in OECD countries has increased from 9 to 11%. This is not a marginal increase in many countries. So we have countries like Czechia or like Iceland, where the share of immigrants has doubled in the last 10 years. When we're talking about immigrants in the OECD context, we have to keep in mind that it always refers, for international comparisons, to the foreign-born populations. Okay, so for instance, in Estonia or in Latvia, we are capturing also long-standing Russian-speaking communities and not only recent migrants as in the other countries. Having said that, we think that the share of immigrants in OECD countries is only going to increase because in the last year, migration flows to OECD countries were overall at record levels. So in 2023, there were 6.5 million permanent type migrants to OECD countries. This is a large increase relative to 2022 and a very large increase relative to the numbers pre-pandemic in 2019. And it's the largest flow we've seen since we've started doing this type of data work at the OECD about 20 years ago of comparing flows across countries. And it's not only permanent type migration that's at record levels. We're also seeing the number of temporary workers, the number of international students, of asylum requests that have been much higher than pre-pandemic level in the OECD as a whole. In addition to this, we know that OECD countries are providing shelter for nearly 5 million displaced Ukrainians. So these are not in our previous numbers. And we know that the countries that have welcomed the most Ukrainians in terms of numbers are Germany, Poland, and the US. But in terms of the proportion of the population, we know that we see in the figure, it's been Czechia, but also Latvia and Estonia. So given these developments and these large increases of different types of migrations, pretty much in all OECD countries, the question of integration is going to remain key. Okay? And one of the good news of the last years is that the outcomes of immigrants in the labor market have also increased quite substantially. So the employment of immigrants in the OECD was at record levels in 2023. These are also the highest levels we've had seen in the data. So the employment immigrant on average in the OECD of immigrants was about 71.8%, which is just half a percentage point below that of the native born. And we see this positive trend is true in many countries. It's true in the Baltic countries. It's true in the Nordic countries, in the United States, in the EU as a whole. Of course, there are exceptions. One of the exceptions is Germany, that has a large humanitarian population that has not yet fully integrated into the labor market. But overall, we see a very positive picture. Now, immigrants are a very heterogeneous group, and part of the OECD work is really about trying to provide evidence for different categories of migrants separately whenever possible. So this figure is for 2021, but irrespective of the year, we tend to see the same patterns. That is that immigrants who go to the host country for work tend to have much larger employment rates than other immigrants, which is not surprising. Family migrants tend to do quite a bit worse because they have lower labor market attachment in the host country, and humanitarian migrants typically have the most challenges in integrating in the labor market in all countries. So a good rule of thumb is that on average in the EU, in the first years in the host country, the employment rate of immigrants or humanitarian migrants is going to be about 20 to 30%. But when we look at the outcomes of Ukrainian refugees, these are much better. And so they've integrated much more easily into the labor market and have much higher employment rates than the typical or previous refugee waves. This is due to the fact that Ukrainians have had high levels of educational attainment, that there were pre-existing networks, a lot of labor migration from Ukrainians also already previously in the main host countries. And we've seen this morning in the first presentations or first speeches from the UNHCR, some more recent numbers in terms of employment rates for the Baltic countries. This will be updated by my colleagues that are working on the Ukrainian country project by the end of the year, where a new report will come out on this. Another group that typically has quite some difficulties integrating into the labor market are immigrant women. So we know that on average in the OECD, in the last year we have data in 2023, the employment rate of women was 60%. This was similar to that of the native born, but it's not true in all countries. So in some countries we have very large gaps. This is the case in the EU, where the gap between the employment rate of migrant women, native born women is about 8 percentage points. And there are countries where the gap is much larger. So if we look at the Nordic countries, in Finland, in Norway, in Sweden, the gaps are over 10 percentage points for women and up to 20 percentage points in the Netherlands. But there are large gaps in pretty much all the countries that we have data for. Part of the gaps between migrant and native-born women are due to the motherhood penalty. So it's the fact that immigrant women who have children have particularly large difficulties integrating into the labor market. And so we see that if we consider just mothers, there's a 20 percentage point gap in employment rate between native and foreign-born women. This is very large. So in the Baltic countries, we have data for Latvia and for Estonia. The gaps are large, but not as large as in other countries at 10, 15 percentage points. But we get to 20 points in Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and even 30 points in Norway or France, and even in Southern European countries like Greece or Italy and Spain. So this is really a fact that irrespective of the labor market we're considering, is present everywhere. And these are very different labor markets. And so there was some work done on this topic in 2023. So in the flagship publication of the OECD, which is called the International Migration Outlook, there was a special chapter on migrant mothers, so on the labor market integration of migrant mothers. And the report shows also that the differences are linked to individual preferences, of course, but also to institutions, because what we see is that migrant mothers tend to more often report that they are in part-time, but it's not voluntary part-time. They're forced to be working part-time because they don't have other options, or they're forced into inactivity. So this is a question that if you're interested, I invite you to read the report. There's also been a report specific to the Nordic countries, supported by the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is called the labor market integration of migrant mothers and fathers in the Nordic countries. It was released in the fall. That looks at the same topic, but focuses only on the Nordic countries. And there are also solutions and examples of best practice policies that go from taking into account the difficulties of migrant mothers in the integration courses that are offered, to make sure that there's childcare available, to make sure that they can stop and take the courses later when they have children. Other support strategies in terms of network. We've just heard about the example of Denmark in having mixed groups from all backgrounds for expecting parents. So this is one of the possibilities, but any other policies that might help migrant mothers integrate, being often through examples through the kindergarten participation, bringing mothers in to integrate in that educational context has also been a solution among others. So I invite you to look at these reports if this is a question that you're interested in exploring. In this year's publication, we're looking at a project on migrant entrepreneurship from different angles. And so there's really, we wanted to focus on, or bringing to the discussion the value of migrant entrepreneurship in terms of innovation and in terms of employment, but also thinking a little bit about what it means in terms of integration. So we all have this idea that migrants are more entrepreneurial than the native born. So what we see is that on average in the OECD, immigrants are as likely to be self-employed than the native born. So in a lot of the data work, entrepreneurs are defined as the self-employed because this is where we have comparative data across all countries. So we see the OECD point that's really in the middle of the graph. The self-employment rate is about 13.8% for the foreign-born, 13.4% for the native-born, pretty much the same. But in 2/3 of the countries, immigrants are in fact more likely to be self-employed than the native-born. These are countries like Eastern European countries, in particular in Czechia, the Slovak Republic, also in Canada, in the United States. We see it's also the case in Lithuania and Estonia. And on the other hand, we have countries where immigrants never go into self-employment or almost never, which is going to be Iceland, but also Japan and Korea. And this is because most migrants are labor migrants who come to the host country already with the job offer. So they are employees, they do not go into self-employment. So there's a lot of variety in the contexts that we're looking at. What is migrants' contribution to innovation? So, we all see regular headlines about the large contributions that migrants make in terms of innovation. Typically, these are headlines that come from the United States. And we know, for instance, that in 2023, 45% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants and their children, or that half of American unicorns, that is startups valued at $1 billion or more, were founded by immigrants. So our question here was really to try to go beyond the US, go beyond these very exceptional firms, and understand the contribution of migrant entrepreneurs to all firms of the economies. So perhaps unsurprisingly, most self-employed are not working in very high and medium-high research and development sectors, according to the OECD classification. So it's only about 5%, but it's similar. The share of foreign-born and native-born working in these sectors is quite similar. The distribution of self-employed across sectors, be migrants or non-migrants, it's more similar than we might think. There are studies only for Canada and the US, unfortunately not for many OECD countries, where there's a look at migrant-founded firms and native-born founded firms and try to see actually at the firm level what are the innovation measures that are being taken. And there we find different results. Often it's quite similar, or there is a little small advantage of immigrant firms. But overall, the conclusion from these studies is that migrants do contribute disproportionately to innovation, and this is mainly due to the fact that they are overrepresented among entrepreneurs more than to differences in the firms that they are creating. In terms of employment, we'd like to quantify also how much employment are migrant entrepreneurs bringing to OECD economies. The first thing to know is that in almost all countries, self-employed migrants are less likely to have employees than the native-born, and when they do, they have fewer of them. This is a very robust fact that we hadn't seen before, and it's robust to controlling for the type of activity that they work in, and also by their individual characteristics. So, and it holds pretty much about in all countries. Of course, we need to know that in most cases, like in 2/3 of the self-employed, they have no employees at all. They are own account workers. But nevertheless, if we do a simple back of the envelope calculation, for every 10 working age migrants, we have an additional 2 jobs that are added to the economy on average over the 25 countries that we have data for. Given the large increase in migrant populations over the last years, this implies 4 million additional jobs from 2011 to 2021, and this is about 15% of the total employment growth in these 25 countries. There are countries in which immigrants actually, so per working age person, migrants are actually creating more jobs than the native born. So this is the case in the United States, in the United Kingdom, but also in the Czech Republic or in Hungary or in Norway. And this is because migrants are more likely to be self-employed, not because they are creating large companies. So we really have this margin of migrants contributing disproportionately because they just go into self-employment more often. Of course, the other side of the coin is that a lot of job creation by immigrants and creating their own jobs comes as a response to not being able to integrate into the labor market. And this is a conference about integration, so I wanted to bring this point again. And we're looking at this, what we call self-employment by necessity. And we wanted to look some direct evidence on whether this is happening and to which extent. And so, at least for EU, EFTA, OECD countries, we found from the survey that's a few years old, where people are actually asked why are they self-employed, what drove them to that choice, and we do see that migrants who are self-employed would have preferred in more cases than the native born to be employees, and they 2 times as many foreign-born than native-born actually say that the reason they are self-employed is because they could not find a job. So it's a pathway that's in some cases it's a constrained choice, but the question is that we should not stop at being self-employed. Okay, you're integrated into the labor market, which was a lot the discussion that we've just had on the fact that integration is a process and we need to look long term. And so what we looked at in the data was to say, okay, people are going into self-employment, migrants are going more often into self-employment. Now, do the business survive? And we see that each year, migrants are also more likely to be exiting self-employment. And in some cases, to unemployment more often than the native born. And the numbers are quite large, because in some countries, like in Austria or Switzerland, Denmark, Greece, Portugal, quite different countries, immigrants are at least 50% more likely to leave self-employment in any given year. So if we want this solution as an integration solution to be durable, we also have to make sure that it's going to be a stepping stone to finding a wage employment or a business that will survive. We're talking about the outcomes of migrant women, and well, when it comes to self-employment or entrepreneurship, only 1/3 of migrant entrepreneurs are women. This is true for migrant entrepreneurs, also true for native-born entrepreneurs. Women are very underrepresented in this sector. And when we look at all these indicators of some fragility in integrating the labor market, we do find that the results are stronger for women. So migrant women are more likely to go into self-employment than native-born women, but they're also more likely to give up and exit self-employment. They're also, in European countries, more likely to say that actually they would prefer to work as employees, and much more likely than native-born women. So there are signs that this is really an integration strategy that is forced, and to which we have to pay a bit more attention. Of course, when we were looking at what's new in migrant entrepreneurship, one of the elephants in the room is how does this fit with the development of the gig economy and the platform work. So, if you just look around in many OECD countries, casual observation, we do have a feeling that immigrants are overrepresented in these types of jobs. But there's not a lot of evidence yet. And so we've looked at some evidence for Canada, for the United States. In particular, there's a brand new survey questions for Canada that show that if we take into account everyone who has declared that they have given Lyft to someone else through Uber or through Lyft or another similar platform, 2/3 are immigrants. So this is a vast overestimation relative to their weight in the population. And of course, the concern relative to this type of platform work is that workers are declared as self-employed. So we're catching them in the statistics, but in many cases, their work conditions are very close to those of employees. So it's what we call false self-employment. And in this case, people don't have the same social security than if they were employees and declared as such, which is a concern for their integration and their long-term integration in particular. So there's also some evidence for European countries when we look at it, because we see that self-employed migrants are more likely to declare that they cannot choose their working hours relative to the native-born, and that they have only one client or one dominant client, which puts them more at risk of being considered false self-employed. I wanted to just briefly also talk a little bit about housing challenges faced by immigrants across the OECD. So it's a question we have done not that much work yet. So there are just some pieces of evidence here and there, but it's a question that we keep facing in all these OECD countries, because a prerequisite to being able to integrate into the labor market, into society, is finding affordable housing, and different countries are struggling with different aspects of this housing question. So if we look at indicators of housing for immigrants, we see that, for example, more than 1 in 6 immigrants live in overcrowded conditions in the OECD and in the EU. In the EU, this is a rate that's about 70% higher than that of the native-born. And when we look at other indicators, we see similar results. So we see that immigrants are more likely to live in substandard conditions, of spending more of their disposable income on rent than the native-born, and this is true in pretty much all countries. So depending on the exact problem that countries are facing in this area, there have been different policy responses. And so responses go from financial assistance, for instance, to help with rents or even with loans for populations more at risk. So this is the case, for example, a program in Colombia to help Venezuelan refugees with rental subsidies. The problem might also be at different types of migrant populations. A big issue with migrant workers is to ensure that their rental contracts is not linked to their work contracts. So there's been some new legislation in the Netherlands ensuring that these are separate things. This is also a recurrent problem in Japan and in Portugal, very different countries where there's quite some labor migration. Another different topic also related to housing that has some policy answers has been the case of international students. So international students in countries in the OECD that welcome a lot of international students, like the Netherlands, but also like Canada. There's been a lot of discussion on the pressure that this is putting on housing. So in some cases, the number of international students is just going down. So this is the point in Canada, or there are restrictions to the demand in housing by temporary migrants not being able to buy housing in big centers, but there's also policies that look at increasing the housing stock, so the offer of housing, and this is a plan, for instance, in the Netherlands that has the aim of increasing the supply of housing for international students. So very diverse situations, very diverse policies. Of course, an extreme risk in terms of housing is the risk of homelessness. And so this is something we don't know much about. So there's been this last year a brief that was done together with the Social Policy Division at OECD that works on housing to try to understand what are the risks for migrants. And in over half of the OECD countries, we just don't have any data. For countries that we do have data that come from different censuses and surveys, we find that migrants are highly overrepresented among the homeless. So we see, for instance, in Finland, we're at about 4 times more likely for migrants to be homeless than the native born. In Norway, 3 times, or in Germany, 2 times. And this is true pretty much across all the countries we have data. So this is a question that would need to know a little bit more than we know at this stage. And a final issue on housing that I'm sure you also think about this very often is the problem of reception capacity. So all countries that have had fluctuating inflows of humanitarian migrants struggle with this issue. And this is true in the recent case of Ukrainian refugees, but also the other waves for countries that are at the borders of the European Union. We're working with Bulgaria. This was a big concern also, is how do you adapt reception capacities to changing flows? And the responses go from the traditional dispersal of immigrants and the cooperation, the very important cooperation with the municipalities, but also to relying increasingly so on external service providers or even on private households, and to ensure that you also provide support, financial support to private hosts has become a lot more common in the last years. So I tried to give you really a bit of an overview of and not comprehensive at all, of what's been going on at OECD in terms of specific topics on integration that we're looking at that are of interest pretty much to all member countries. And we've seen that the migration flows to the OECD have increased quite sharply in the last few years. This is a trend that seems ongoing, that the outcomes of all types of labor migrants, of all migrants, labor migrants, and not only, have improved. This is mainly due to very good labor market conditions in the past years, but that challenge in integration remain. They remain for refugees, of course, they remain for migrant women and migrant mothers that we're trying to understand a little bit more, and do require a little bit of different integration perspective. The question of self-employment is a possible pathway to integrate in the labor market. In particular, is a pathway that has been used a lot in integration programs for refugees and contributes significantly to the employment in the OECD economies, but more attention is needed to the long-term outcomes of these migrant entrepreneurs. I will leave you some references of the different studies I've mentioned and ongoing publications. You also have my email in case there are any questions, any further references. I'll be very happy to reply. And I thank you very much for your attention.